The queen's gambit arises after the opening moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, then pawn to c4. It is one of the most popular gambits in the entire game of chess. I'm going to show you 3 powerful opening traps. Some of these are classical and might be familiar to you already. But even if you're an advanced player, there may be something here that can help you surprise your opponents and gain the upper hand early. Let's begin with a classic example. Suppose black accepts the gambit and then tries to hold on to the extra pawn, refusing to return it to white. One common way black does this is by playing pawn to b5, reinforcing the pawn on c4. Now, how can white challenge this setup? White should play pawn to a4, aiming to undermine the b5 pawn, which is currently supporting black's extra pawn on c4. And now, what can black do? If black tries the symmetrical response by playing pawn to a 6, it does not really work. After white captures the pawn on b5, now black cannot recapture because the pawn on a 6 is pinned by the bishop. In this case, black would simply lose the rook on a 8. Let's consider what else black can do. Another option is for black to play pawn to c6. At first glance, it looks like everything is just fine for black. However, surprisingly, black is actually losing. White should trade the pawns by capturing on b5. And here comes a winning continuation. Can you find it? By the way, it's a fun fact that this exact position once occurred in a game played by the 4th world chess champion Alexander Alekhine. He actually failed to find the winning move, quite surprisingly. The winning move is queen to f3. It may look a bit sudden, but in this position, there is no way for black to save the rook on a 8. That is a very unexpected twist, and white wins the game right on the spot. Alright, so that was the first trap, a pretty classical one. Nevertheless, I have checked in the database, and even today, strong players rated 2000 and beyond still fall into this trap regularly. And therefore, even if you know this trap, it does not necessarily mean that your opponents know it, so you can still go ahead and give it a try. Now, let's move on to trap number 2. As we already know, after white plays pawn to c4, offering this pawn as a gambit, if black tries to capture it and then attempts to keep the pawn by playing pawn to b5, it does not really work well. That's why, instead, black usually continues with development, most commonly by playing knight to f6 with the idea of recapturing the pawn later. Some players especially enjoy fianchettoing their kingside bishop, and they play pawn to g6. While this is not the main line, it's still a fairly common idea that your opponents might use. Now, here comes something interesting you can do. After the natural development moves knight to f3 and bishop to g7, instead of simply making another routine development move, you can play one surprising idea. Queen to a4, giving a check. At first glance, this seems like a strange or unnecessary move, but in reality, it's not so simple for black to deal with. Let's examine why. If black responds with bishop to d7, trying to block the check, then white can retreat the queen to b3. And now, take a look. This is actually a double attack on black's pawn on f7 and pawn on b7. On the very next move, white can even increase the pressure by developing the knight to e5, intensifying the threats. And that's why this position becomes quite unpleasant for black. What makes it even trickier is that black's most natural-looking responses often backfire. For example, many players instinctively develop by playing knight to c6, but that too turns out to be problematic. In this case, white can immediately jump forward with knight to e5, a very powerful central move that takes advantage of the pin on the knight on c6 created by the queen on a4. At the same time, this active white knight on e5, supported by the bishop on c4, is attacking the pawn on f7, one of the most vulnerable squares in the opening. It's also attacking the knight on c6, meaning that black cannot defend both threats at once. So once again, this seemingly natural development move, knight to c6, actually leads black into serious trouble. Let's consider another idea. What if black plays queen to d7, trying to develop and break the pin at the same time? Now let me ask you, can you spot the winning move for white here? Take a moment to think about it. Ready? Here's the crushing blow. Bishop captures on f7, boom. It looks like just a sacrifice, but in reality, it wins the game immediately. If black captures the bishop with the king, then white follows up with knight to e5, which is a fork, attacking both the king and the queen at the same time. Black loses the queen, and with it, the game. A very elegant and deadly trap that shows how just a few imprecise moves can lead to a total collapse, even in such simple-looking positions. Let's take a step back for a moment. Is there any way for black to escape all of these tactical problems? The answer is yes, there is. But it's not so easy for black to figure it out over the board. Let's take a look at another potential idea for black, knight to d7. Interestingly enough, white can still use the same tactical motif. bishop captures on f7, even though in this case the idea behind it is slightly different. After black recaptures the bishop with the king, white continues with knight to g5, giving a check. At this point, black is in a very uncomfortable position. If the black knight tries to come back to defend, say to f8 or e8, then white has a brilliant follow-up, knight to a6, a devastating move that wins the black queen on d8, which now has no safe squares to run to. Alternatively, if black tries to avoid all of that by moving the king back to g8, then the queen is temporarily safe, but white simply continues with queen to c4. Now, the threat of queen to f7 checkmate is unavoidable on one of the next few moves. Black is completely lost. So, does that mean all hope is lost for black? Not at all. The position is still very much playable for both sides. The easiest and safest move for black is simply to play pawn to c6. With that move, black stabilizes the position and avoids the major traps. Now here's what I really like about this trap for white. Even if the opponent avoids the trap, you're not spoiling your position in any way. The setup is completely natural. You're developing your pieces, and the game continues with normal play. Just one thing to be careful about. After black plays pawn to c6, they may follow up with pawn to b5, trying to kick your pieces back. That's why you should immediately respond with queen to b3, applying pressure on the f7 pawn, and keeping up the initiative. So even if the trap doesn't work, the position stays solid and full of attacking chances. And that's what makes this trap so practical. It's not very well known, and therefore, you have a realistic chance to win several games just by using this idea alone. Let's move on to trap number 3, which takes place in the well-known Queen's Gambit declined. We begin from the typical Queen's Gambit setup. White plays pawn to d4, black responds with pawn to d5, and then white offers the gambit with pawn to c4. If you're not a regular Queen's Gambit player and prefer other openings, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to cover traps in those as well. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Now, as we've seen before, black cannot successfully grab and hold on to the pawn on c4. So the most common and solid move is pawn to e6, reinforcing the center and continuing development. At this point, black plays the seemingly quiet move, knight to d7. On the surface, it looks harmless, but it hides a clever tactical trap. I still remember falling for this myself when I first joined a chess club. A stronger player used this exact trick, and I had no idea what was coming. Here's how it works. White notices the pin on the knight on f6, created by the bishop on g5, and decides to capture the pawn on d5 with knight. It seems like a free pawn. Black responds with knight, and now white sees the queen on d8 is undefended, so white eagerly captures it. But here comes the surprise. A bishop to b4, check by black. White has no good way to block the check except queen to d2, which forces a queen trade. After that, black finishes the sequence with an extra knight, gaining a winning material advantage. So what looked like a blunder by black was actually a smart trap. If you've never seen this before, now you know how to avoid it, and perhaps even use it to your advantage.